Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Scary Stories We Tell. I am your host, Chris Dashew, and I am joined by pop culture writer, professor, critic, all the good things in the world, I think. You've been described by Vogue as sexy, rebellious, and cool, and I would agree with all of those things, at least a couple times. I think this is the third time that you and I have ever podcasted together?
It's hard for me to keep track. That sounds about right.
Yeah. Because we did one show for Mike's show on Office Killer, and then you've been on. This is the second time you're on this show. So, and then I there was another time that we were in something. Maybe it was one of Mike White's cocktail hours.
Oh,
were you around for one of those?
I think it was one of the viewing parties.
Yeah,
because that's how we first connected, and then we were talking about getting me on your podcast to talk about Black Dahlia and haunted houses and stuff like that.
Yeah. So her reputation precedes her. Dahlia Schweitzer.
Yes. Thanks for having me on. I can't wait to dig into this.
Yeah. And so on this episode, if you have clicked on it, you know what you're going to be listening to. But if you just happened upon us, we are going to be talking a little bit about the life and death of Elizabeth Short, who is commonly referred to as the Black Dahlia, though I'm sure we can dig into all kinds of things about even just that moniker alone and the loss of one's autonomy in their own story, as that seems to happen with beautiful women being murdered, regardless of the time and place. But if you are not familiar with the Black Dahlia murder, Dahlia, I'm going to turn it over to you because you're more of an expert than I am. And you even did a little write-up that I read, and you suggested the book that we are going to be talking a little bit about, the Piu Eatwell book that came out a couple years ago, that kind of has some interesting theories that I don't think anybody else has been kind of approaching. The book came out in 2017, Black Dahlia, Red Rose, which we'll be talking about. We'll talk about all the Black Dahlia kind of information and things surrounding it. But Dahlia, for those of my listeners who maybe don't know the Black Dahlia case, which feels impossible, frankly, tell the audience a little bit about what makes the murder of Elizabeth Short so important to you, and I guess broadly in the scope of true crime and the way true crime has been approached since her murder happened.
Fantastic. So I feel like sort of general consensus is that the Black Dahlia murder is the most compelling unsolved crime that Los Angeles has ever known, and I would argue that it's up there with maybe the top 10 unsolved crimes in America. At least in terms of its sort of lasting impact. And I don't know, and that's what we'll sort of unpack a bit today. This sort of sensationalized element of the case and the way that it has impacted media and storytelling and music videos. And it's really had this sort of ripple effect that, as you said, really transcends the life of this one woman about whom we still know very little, despite all the exposure given to her death. So just to kind of backpedal a little bit, I don't even know when I first became interested in the Black Dahlia, but I know that my interest in her kind of skyrocketed when I happened to move to a neighborhood in Los Angeles that was around the corner from where many people believe she was murdered. And I have a dog, and I would walk, down this street multiple times a day, and it was like the house was right there. And so it sort of became this constant part of my consciousness, just thinking about this woman, who I think maybe looks a little bit like me. We obviously share a name, body size, and I don't know, there's just something about this woman who sort of became lost to the dominant narrative of all these white men who surrounded her in life and after death. Just really kind of fascinated me. So just to kind of give the brief overview of the all too familiar story by now is in January 1947, this woman was walking by this kind of deserted lot in Los Angeles. And she initially thought it was a mannequin, like a broken mannequin that she saw. And she kind of went over to take a closer look. And it was actually the body of this woman. And the reason why she at first thought it was a mannequin was because of how the body had been mutilated. Perhaps most grotesquely, the body had been cut in half and the two pieces were sort of separate from each other, which is partly what made them not look like a body. But the way that the pieces were arranged, there was a gash kind of cut on either side of her mouth to make it look like she had almost like a Joker-esque kind of smile. And then different seemingly random pieces of flesh were removed from her breasts and thighs. Her hands were over her head. Also, very strangely, the body had been totally drained of blood. So it was she was almost like this kind of, I mean, she was a very pale-skinned woman when she was alive, but this made her seem even more doll-like and sort of alabaster colored. And then even more, another layer of weirdness was that the entire body had been cleaned with gasoline, which made it impossible to find fingerprints, which is one of the reasons why the case is sort of famously unsolved, was that there was really no evidence to be found on the body. And then so it was this really kind of shocking murder for obvious, visual reasons, but also this was during a time period where a lot of women were moving to Los Angeles and Hollywood to become actresses. There was still this kind of allure of, the Wild West with its promise of economic prosperity and opportunity. And so it still kind of had this idea in people's head of being sort of, Hollywood glamour, palm trees, etc. So this murder, I mean, this is like, 15 years before Marilyn Monroe's death. It was really like this eye-opening thing where it was like, oh my God, women are in danger. And it got a tremendous amount of media exposure. And, as the police became kind of unable to solve it, the journalists were like, what's going on? What's going on? And so anyway, it just kind of became this very sort of sensationalized spectacle, which has, I think, kind of grown larger than life because it was never solved. And then now there are all these different theories about who did it. And so it's just become this kind of juicy mess of a story with no answers. And as we'll talk about in the book, sort of way too much information.
Way too much information and a lot of differing information, obviously. I mean, like you've kind of already mentioned, with a lot of these cases that are unsolved that get a level of attention that so many cases don't, because there are more unsolved murders that people aren't talking about than there are that people are. With something like this, it's always been interesting to me how much attention it's gotten because, again, like you've kind of already mentioned, the woman at the heart of it has been lost, given essentially no interest almost from the get-go, which is a problem in and of itself. But ultimately, my just kind of immediate gut reaction to the Black Dahlia case and Elizabeth Short's murder is just a question of, and now it's not even about who did it anymore. It's about how did society fail Elizabeth Short, and then how did society fail Elizabeth Short in life and in death? Because it feels like ultimately the story and kind of the thing that's worth digging into, one of the many things that's worth digging into with this story is how society failed her in life and in death. I mean, there are plenty of cases like this one that don't get any attention. One of the first cases we ever talked about on this show is the 1908 unsolved murder of Hazel Drew in Sand Lake, New York, which up in your neck of the woods would go on to inform and influence a lot of other things that a lot of people really care about now. The name of that episode on our show is A Fish in the Percolator, because that murder inspired directly Twin Peaks. Mark Frost grew up in that area of the world. That murder inspired Twin Peaks because it was an unsolved murder of a young woman who was found out in the open and was murdered by an unknown assailant, and it's never been solved. And, they're still working on it today. There are people like John Holzer making documentaries about that murder. So the murder of young women in this country that are unsolved is a lightning rod for a lot of people. I think fortunately, unfortunately, we can talk about the aspects of that in and of itself. But just for me, initially thinking about the Black Dahlia murder, it's almost like Elizabeth Short and the Black Dahlia murder are two different things, and they should have always been. And to conflate the two is one of the problems here, because I almost want to not refer to this as the Black Dahlia, just the murder of Elizabeth Short, because the Black Dahlia is something that happens after the fact. It's after all of this. It's after she's been murdered. She wasn't referred to as the Black Dahlia by anybody beforehand. this is a complete, a complete fabrication.
This is actually a point of contention because, and this is one of the things that fascinates me about it, is how little is known about Elizabeth Short.
Right.
And one of the things that I have not been able to find a clear answer for is who came up with the nickname the Black Dahlia.
Right.
And so she actually might have been called that in life. And it just seems like that would be something that would be so easy to verify and make clear. But there is a lot of discrepancy about, was it a nickname that was given to her during her life by her friends? Or was it a nickname that was given to her by the press after her death? And in the book, she actually mentions that it was someone who ran a drugstore who called her the Black Dahlia, which is a theory that I haven't heard. So there's sort of three different possibilities. Again, how hard would it have been to determine that? Also, another fact that should be really easy to clarify, but isn't, is that I've read differing opinions about whether or not she wanted to be an actress.
Right.
There are some sources that say she had no interest in being an actress. She just happened to be in LA, and a beautiful woman can be in LA and not want to be an actress. But it's become such a part of the lexicon that she was an aspiring actress, even though it doesn't seem like there are any auditions that she ever went on. So it's become this kind of the stuff of urban legend. And then when you take a step back and you're like, well, wait, where's the proof that she wanted to be an actress? And there isn't any. And again, it's kind of like the layers of fiction have become so opaque that we don't see the Elizabeth Short. And that's why it does feel like the Black Dahlia has become this spectacle, and it's this I think that's another reason why I'm so fascinated by it, is that it's kind of like where Baudrillard writes about in postmodernism, where it's like the copy becomes more powerful than the original, so much so that we kind of lose the original. And that's really what happens with Elizabeth Short, where it's like, Ryan Murphy has an episode of American Horror Story that's clearly inspired by the Black Dahlia, where she goes, she's an aspiring actress. And I read an interview with Ryan Murphy where he's talking about her as an aspiring actress. And it's like, wait a second. We don't actually know that she was an aspiring actress. We don't even know where the nickname came from. And like, if you were a police officer at the time, I don't know why, really, they couldn't just determine, again, and this goes back to was it nobody cared? I don't know. It's all just very weird to me that these are very basic fundamental facts about which we cannot agree.
Well, and that is something that, again, as someone who the Black Dahlia murder, or the murder of Elizabeth Short, again, I'm going to keep hounding myself in going in that direction. Her murder, for me, is not one that drew me in. My kind of case of this is and will always be the Zodiac case. But in that case, there are things that are answered, and there's where did the name come from? XYZ, who did he kill? I mean, again, who did he kill is maybe less known, because again, you can't know everybody that he killed because he was making a lot of claims. But it is weird to me reading the Piu Eatwell book and just doing all the other research necessary to have a genuinely engaging conversation about this. The fact that the name has become so kind of just it is so synonymous with her that her name becomes lost to it. I mean, like you mentioned, perception and reality don't exist anymore. I mean, perception is fucking reality now. So yeah, her being an actress, they have no proof of that anywhere. Feels like something, like you said, easy to nail down. Feels like something easy to nail down where the name came from. I mean, these are easy, 1A, 1B pieces of information that should have been easier to determine. We can kind of talk about why that was the case with some of these things, intentionally, obviously. But the issue at hand with her initially really does boil down to, she's a woman in LA who gets murdered. And why that wasn't a bigger deal, that it was a woman who got murdered. It was less about her being murdered and more how her body was found and the sensationalism behind how her body was found. And almost losing, it's like they painted her in an unfavorable light to almost justify her being murdered or her asking for it. It's this weird victim blaming thing that we see now in a lot of ways. I mean, if you look at other women who have been murdered, that their cases have gotten national interest, look at someone like Gabby Petito this year. I mean, there's a lot of people who verge on blaming her for being murdered by someone else. And it's like, you can't do that, because instead of focusing on the victim, we're focusing on what the victim did to put themselves in that scenario. And it's like, nobody's asking to be murdered. Nobody's asking to be cut in half and put in an empty lot in LA. But a lot of the information and the stories at the time kind of make it seem that way. Well, she's an actress in LA and she's maybe a sex worker, so she put herself in a position to be murdered, and she got murdered. So, well, there you go. And to start your story at that point, which is where the story starts for a lot of people who were working on the case and informing the public about the case at the time, it's like that's just the wrong foot to start on. But that's where this case starts, is it starts on the wrong foot almost initially.
Yeah, I want to just kind of point out two things in response to that I have in this essay that I've been working on. But I have a quote by this guy, Daniel Cohen, who says, Elizabeth Short became the epitome of the complex cultural motif summarized by the phrase beautiful female murder victim. And so, again, if she had been older, if she had been less beautiful, obviously, it would not have become this kind of juicy morsel for journalists.
Or even African American. I mean, again.
Oh, well, that's the whole. I mean, that's
but
like
again,
it's a thing.
Right,
nobody cares about the murder of Black women.
Right, but even more so, like even people make the joke about women. It's not women so much as it's white women. That's just the long and the short of it. And again, we make jokes about it all the time. Another white woman is missing. Another white woman got murdered, but it's real, and it was worse in 1947 than it is now, obviously. But it's awful all around.
Right. And so kind of going along with the creation of the Black Dahlia persona, which, as we've established, is separate from the actual human being, Elizabeth Short, the media created this narrative that, that the murder was somehow sexual in nature, that there was this sort of sexual fall, or, this kind of a sexual criminal. And one of the things that's interesting is and I think another reason why people forget that there's a human at the heart of this is that at the time of her death, film noir was popular, and the name the Black Dahlia, from whoever invented it, was sort of a reference to a popular film from 1946 called The Blue Dahlia, which was a noir film that had been written by Raymond Chandler. And so it was kind of like people, I think, saw Elizabeth Short as almost like a character in a movie, because she fit so well within, first her appearance. If you don't know what she looks like, the pale skin, the black hair, she wore lots of black. She was kind of very fashionable. She looks very glamorous in the main photo that sort of circulated in newspapers. And so it really lent itself to creating this narrative that, again, is sort of detached from reality, and which is why people kind of project these things on her. And one of the things that to me is so disturbing is there's a photograph of Dita Von Teese, who is, considered to be this incredibly beautiful, glamorous, sexy woman. So there's a photograph of her in which she's recreating the Black Dahlia. Now, she's not recreating Elizabeth Short alive. She's recreating the Black Dahlia, the body seemingly mutilated as the Black Dahlia was, in this sort of very beautiful photograph. Like she's recreating the mutilated body. Dita Von Teese, in a photograph that you can go into a gallery and you can, it's just, it's like, I don't know, you just kind of want to shake people and just say, this was a human being, who was not only murdered, but was like horrifically, graphically mutilated.
Well, and so that's, you mentioned Ryan Murphy, who I think as someone who's gay, I can appreciate what Ryan Murphy has done to elevate gay issues, gay actors, not the gay agenda in a lot of ways, but what I care about as someone who is gay and what I would like the world to know about the experiences that I have. And I think Ryan Murphy's done a decent job at that. But I also think Ryan Murphy's done a shit job at a lot of other things. Mm-hmm, that Dahmer show being one of them, because the Dahmer show speaks to essentially what you're talking about. A complete mishandling of what makes this important.
Mhm.
And, they claim in that show, well, we're going to give the victims their due, and we're going to make it so that the victims' families are able to understand, or you as an audience member can understand what the victims went through, and taking the victims' stories back from Jeffrey Dahmer. That's great and all, but that's not what any of this is. All of this is just existing for entertainment's sake. It's still, if you want to give the victims their due, make a documentary about it. Don't make a show where you have Mina Suvari playing Elizabeth Short, quote unquote, as a poor take, a uninformed take, a take that, again, where Ryan Murphy got his information from, I have no idea. He's never said. You mentioned in your essay he's never said. And it shows, because most of the information is completely wrong, but it exists to be fictionalized, but it adds to a snowball that's been going since 47 of massive amounts of information. I don't know how much of this is even true anymore. It's so hard to sort through even the things, Piu Eatwell in her book, like the first third of her book is all about Elizabeth Short, but that information is scant at best. It's first and second hand accounts. And Elizabeth Short lived in effectively a very uninteresting life up until the moment she died. It's not like she was doing anything exciting. It's not like she was ultimately anything other than just another woman trying to live in LA in 1947. That, like you said, that's the thing that does get lost here, is she was just another woman looking to make her way in the world. For whatever reason, she wasn't able to past 1947. Whoever did whatever they did to her stopped that from happening. But it's that losing the sight of the person at the center of it that I have a hard time even talking about true crime anymore in rectifying, because nobody wants to talk about the victims. Nobody does. And it's weird. In the case with Dahmer, it's about the serial killer, not the victims. Here, where it should be about the victim, ostensibly it is, it's about, it ends up being about George Hodel. It ends up being about how beautiful her corpse was presented. And it's, guys, we're missing the point here. There is a human being at the center of this who is no longer alive.
And I think what's interesting is just the terminology, like kind of like you were saying, we have the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, Son of Sam, right? That usually the name refers to the murderer, and here the name refers to the murdered person, right? And then that it eclipses any kind of humanity that you have. So
right.
Most people who are familiar with the Black Dahlia might not recognize the name Elizabeth Short.
I would wager they wouldn't or don't.
And probably don't know any biographical opinion about her. I mean, I just kind of like, I'm just kind of curious to go to like Dita Von Teese and just say, do you know anything about Elizabeth Short, or did you just want to like she has a photo shoot that she did in the house that is the one that I lived near, where she's sort of like recreating the Black Dahlia, and she has like in her lingerie line, there's like the Black Dahlia lingerie. I mean, she's obviously very fascinated with the Black Dahlia, and it's just kind of again, it's just weird.
With Dita Von Teese or the Black Dahlia murders, I take less of an issue with that, only because I feel like the intent is subversion, to be subversive, to be, edgy, I guess is another way of putting it. But I feel like edgy kind of has a inherently negative connotation. It feels inherently subversive. And I can appreciate that, because art can be, and, in a lot of ways, it being subversive helps move the conversation along. The problem I have is it adds nothing to the conversation about the Black Dahlia or the murder of Elizabeth Short. Because I think like kind of we've mentioned here, it's important to separate the two, because they're almost, Elizabeth Short stops existing the day she gets found, the day her corpse is found, and all that matters is the Black Dahlia afterwards. And that in and of itself is a shame. But I kind of don't. I do and don't have an issue with what Dita Von Teese did, because, again, part of it is removed from reality, and I get it. It's hard not to be removed from it. None of us can understand what happened in 1947, but at the same time, it is in poor taste. But taste is going to be subjective, anyways. A
mutilated body isn't sexy,
right? I don't think so, but she also didn't do it all the way. She did a very sexied version of it. She didn't present herself the way that, if she were actually to do it that way, nobody would find that picture sexy. Nobody would find that picture attractive. It's as she went as far as she could to make it a close approximation of what it was, but she didn't actually present herself in a way that would be, this is Dita Von Teese on the ground in a lot. She's, sitting in a crate. It's already, it's just, it smacks of someone who wanted to pay homage to something, I guess. I just don't understand what the mindset is. I guess that's my issue, is like, what would drive you to do that?
Yeah, to me, it's just the sexualizing of a corpse that is
fucking bizarre. Weird.
A mutilated corpse, not just a.
Because if you go and look at the pictures of Elizabeth Short's body, there's nothing sexy about that, like at all. It is a body drained of blood in a lot in LA somewhere that's been mutilated. How, if you find that sexy, I'm not a doctor, but you may need to seek help. Like I'm not trying to be mean, but if you're sexualizing corpses, there's a deeper issue here, like a much deeper issue.
But that's also why I think it's it's not just like necrophilia, but it's like it's a mutilated, like a heavily mutilated corpse. It's like it's the next level beyond finding dead bodies. I mean, it's just, and I don't know if we want to transition a little bit to talking about who killed her. But I think one of the interesting things in the book is, so theories about the Black Dahlia are a dime a dozen about who killed her. But I've always kind of been ready to embrace the George Hodel version or theory, because that's always kind of made sense to me. And what's interesting is, in the book, she clearly feels like it was this guy, Leslie Dillon. And one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that it's Leslie Dillon is because of the really excessive mutilation. And the Leslie Dillon theory is that Elizabeth Short was getting on this guy, Mark Hansen's nerves. And so Mark Hansen told his sort of sidekick, Leslie Dillon, like, oh, I'm sick of her, take care of her. And then Leslie Dillon interprets that, perhaps incorrectly, as kill her. But I feel like if you were just killing someone because you thought that's what your boss wanted, you wouldn't cut them in half, drain them in blood, do the slash in the mouth, there's like this weird slash in her stomach. I mean, just the kind of almost like ornate nature of the mutilations makes me feel like it's got to be a special kind of crazy to really go to that place. And if you're just, doing like a contract kill for someone, why would you do that? And that's why I feel like George Hodel, as a surgeon, as someone who's clearly depraved, as someone who, is this kind of sadist, like that makes sense to me. But it was sort of like, reading the book where she's really arguing for this guy, Leslie Dillon. And I just wasn't convinced because of the nature of the mutilations. What about you? Were you convinced?
So
are you Leslie?
Well, that's the question. I mean, even, like you've already mentioned, Ryan Murphy in American Horror Story, they say, well, it's essentially our fake George Hodel that did it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the proliferation of the George Hodel story reaches, peak proliferation when it's on American Horror Story, a popular television show that's on a fucking cable network. So I think anybody who has any idea, at least base knowledge, will say George Hodel. I would be inclined to agree. That's where I kind of stood before reading the book. I think after reading the book, Leslie Dillon is an interesting character, a bellhop who's a mortician's assistant. And so that is kind of the entry point to the mutilation, as well. He had prior knowledge because he worked in a mortuary.
Right.
Okay, fine. Maybe, but the way the body is presented to the public, the way that they find it, because again, the intent of the person who killed her was that someone was going to find it the way they found it, walking by, being aghast at it. Again, I don't think they're sending a message, because I don't know what message they were sending, but it's interesting to me because, yeah, Leslie Dillon as a suspect, all that trouble for a woman who knew that you were robbing hotel rooms. It's just, to me, it's a lot of effort to go through. That's, in something like Goodfellas, when they want to murder someone, they just shoot him in the head and throw him in a garbage compactor.
I mean, that's my point.
Right. There's no pomp and circumstance. There's no, it's not Dexter where he's preparing his kill room and he's caressing his tools. That's the person that I assume killed Elizabeth Short, is someone who
because with Dexter, the reason for all the pomp and circumstance was so that he wouldn't get caught.
Right.
So it was all done to make sure that there were no fibers left on the clothing, etc.
Sure.
So with him, all the planning was, yes, he reveled in the kill, but the planning was all related to just being very smart,
right,
so that he wouldn't get caught. Whereas here, obviously he was smart, like with the gasoline and, stuff like that. But the mutilation, I feel like that is something else, because that wasn't about I don't think Dexter would have done that, because that's why I'm on the George Hodel camp, because I feel like it's very important to acknowledge that George Hodel was very interested in art and was very interested in surrealism and was running around with these surrealist artists who treated women as body parts. And if you look at a lot of surrealist art, women are depicted as just being sort of this almost an abstract collection of body parts. And so I feel like if you look at it through that lens, George Hodel makes sense, because that explains this really intense, insane amount of mutilation, because he saw this as a piece of art that he was then displaying. So I just thought it was really interesting that Eatwell in her book doesn't really unpack that much. There's just the sort of crazy level of mutilation the implication I got from the book was that this was Dylan's only kill, and that it was sort of like after this happened, he just kind of went off and lived a normal life, and then just kind of kept obsessing about Elizabeth Short because he named his daughter Elizabeth, which is weird. But it's someone who kills like this doesn't just kill once. Right.
Well, and that's more kind of what I meant with Dexter, is Dexter, as much as he preps the room and everything to make sure he doesn't get caught, in the Dexter books, there's a different characterization where he does enjoy the killing, and he enjoys the ritual and the process of killing someone. And that, I think, for me, is kind of more where I stand, is whoever did it enjoyed doing it. Mm-hmm. and reveled in it, and reveled in the process and the ritual, and again, draining the blood and mutilating the corpse. Is that George Hodel? His son makes it an interesting case. I don't think it's an airtight case. I think it's an interesting case. I think there's, again, like a lot of books that come out every couple years about somebody just discovering that their dad was the Zodiac killer or whatever. Again, it's like a joke at this point, how many times somebody has said, my dad was a Zodiac killer. Let me tell you why. Buy my book, please. Watch my documentary on Investigation Discovery. I forget what the book is called. The Most Dangerous Game of All. The one where the guy's like, it was my dad, and he hated that my mom married an African-American guy. That's his whole justification, is my dad went nuts because my mom married an African-American guy. All right, I guess. The Piu Eatwell book, I think it underserves the Elizabeth Short narrative, because it focuses on the LAPD almost exclusively, and how they were covering everything up, which they may have been, but they may have been covering it up not for the reason the book posits. I would contend that the reason they're covering it up is because they didn't know who the fuck did it. And because they didn't know who the fuck did it, they had to pin it on somebody, or just throw their hands up in the air and say, we don't know. You see it all the time in cases where the public fervor is, solve this murder now. You need to solve it. People have gone down for murders they didn't commit, but they needed to pin it on somebody. Adnan Syed is one of them. Stephen Avery may be another one. There are plenty of those kinds of cases that exist too. The book is interesting. It does talk about a lot of conspiracies and cover-ups within the LAPD, which were going on. There's no question of that. But is this one of the things that was that? I don't think so. Again, the ineptitude of the LAPD seems more apparent than their ability to cover things up and get away with it. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think that's also why I found her focus on Dylan to be a little bit frustrating because it just felt like this sort of myopic focus. Like it was like she just had decided that this was the guy who did it, and then was sort of trying to it just felt to me like she was trying to shoehorn the evidence to support this one theory, whereas she kind of just glosses over the fact that Hodel was accused of incest and sexual assault by his daughter Tamar, and got away with it because he was this powerful person who knew people, and so he got acquitted. And again, I don't have any facts to back this up, but it's like, well, if he was able to get away with that because he knew powerful people, maybe one of the reasons that he was able to get away with the Elizabeth Short's murder was because he knew powerful people. Like it just felt kind of weird how she keeps focusing on it, and then there's one place where she sort of lists, and I just thought it was funny because she says, the report began by acknowledging that there were aspects of the Dahlia case that were problematic in terms of it being Leslie Dillon. And then she goes on to list these problems. And this is, what feels like page upon page upon page of her trying to convince us that it was Dillon. And then she has another section where she's talking about how, because the case was going back and forth between the gangster unit and the homicide division or something like that. And they both had different opinions about who could have done it. So it's like every once in a while, she throws in oh yeah, not everybody agreed with the fact that it was Dillon. But then it just felt to me like she focused a lot on Dillon.
Well, and what it reminds me of, and I'm not sure, have you read the Graysmith Zodiac books, Zodiac and Zodiac Unmasked?
I haven't, but wait, I just found the part in the book where she says it was abundantly clear that there was a serious internal rift in the LAPD over the Dahlia case. The officers of the gangster squad were adamant there was a strong case against Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen. The officers of the homicide detail, on the other hand, dismissed Hansen and Dillon as suspect. So that seems fairly significant. But also, if they supposedly the gangster squad and homicide have access to the same evidence, the same facts. So why would you have such opposing opinions? I don't know. It just, again, I just felt like she glossed over some of this part in her focus on it being Dillon. And then the part where she does talk about George Hodel, she's like, oh yeah, there's this theory. And then she kind of disregards it and move on. And I was like, wait, this is, I don't know, it could be a pretty valid theory.
I mean, I think she mentions George Hodel twice. That's it. And it's like there's a mile marker and she just zooms right past it, which I think does the narrative that she's crafting a massive disservice, because this book is written in 2017. Why would you not acknowledge the other kind of elephant in the room? I mean, again, that's if this case is being put on national television in a narrative format like I Am the Night and American Horror Story before that, and then countless other things before that, and they're all saying the same thing, how can you play ostrich in the sand and keep your head down there and pretend? It's weird because it's similar to, that's why I kind of mentioned the Robert Graysmith Zodiac books, because I read those books, as a teenager, and I was like, oh my God, it's got to be Arthur Lee Allen. It's Arthur Lee Allen. There's nobody else. But then you spend 5 to 10 minutes doing any amount of other research outside of it, and all of a sudden that case against Arthur Lee Allen looks similar to the case against Leslie Dillon. It's like you can poke holes in it pretty easily. Now, the author doesn't want to acknowledge said holes, which is the issue with the Piu Eatwell book. It's the issue with the Zodiac book, is you cannot mention these things in a vacuum. You can't say, well, it's got to be this person based on the evidence. You can't just do that, because then you're doing Elizabeth Short further disservice by pretending that there isn't anybody else. I honestly appreciate the narrative that was presented in the Black Dahlia Red Rose book. I don't know how much water it holds. I think it's an interesting tangent to take, but I think ultimately it serves as another form of noise on the line of an interesting idea, and that's all it is. And yeah, there's some interesting circumstantial evidence, but just like the guy who's in Dealey Plaza, that Errol Morris talked to, who just happened to have an umbrella that day. He didn't do anything wrong. He just happened to be there with an umbrella, and everybody took that as a weird thing that is worth investigating. And then he becomes a possible, complicit in the assassination of JFK. It's like that. Sometimes it is just circumstantial. Sometimes it is just coincidence. Sometimes the universe just does work that way. And did Leslie Dillon know Elizabeth Short? Maybe, but plenty of people knew Elizabeth Short and didn't murder her. So I think it's weird. I think instead of making a suspect out of the evidence, they've made the suspect's case about the evidence. It's not, you don't focus on the suspect. You focus on the evidence and let the suspect come out of that. You don't take the evidence and make it work for a suspect, because that's just corruption. That is why we have so many problems in the justice system now, because people just go, okay, I've got a suspect, let's make the evidence work. That's not okay. That's not how any of this works.
Well, especially if you're writing a book about the Black Dahlia and sort of the mess of the murder investigation, how do you not talk about the other leading theory? And I thought it was interesting. One of the reasons why she says it can't have been George Hodel is that she says that Elizabeth Short's friends didn't know him. And the theory isn't that Elizabeth Short was and her friends were hanging out with George Hodel. The theory is that George Hodel was giving illegal abortions, which we know, and that she went to him to have an abortion. And if you're going to someone to have an abortion, you might not tell your friends, or even if you're telling them that you're going to have an abortion, you might not be like, oh, hey, here's a photo of my doctor. It's like that doesn't disqualify him from being the guy that killed her. My friends don't know my doctors.
Well, I know people that don't know plenty of the people I know. It's strange to me that's the singular qualifier here. I
don't know. I just felt like for me, the book felt like the first third of it, which is the one that's really focusing on Elizabeth Short. That was very interesting. And that was stuff that because again, as we've talked about, there's very little biographical information about this woman. So the first third was really interesting. And then it's the other 2/3, if I hadn't committed to you to finishing the book, I don't know that I would have finished the book, because it just felt like an endless number of incompetent white men doing incompetent things, and it's just this sort of revolving door of people. And it was just so many names. And again, it's Elizabeth Short just disappears. She's in the first third and then she's just gone. And then it's blah, blah, this person, blah, blah, this person, blah, blah, this person. And then I sort of perked up because finally it was George Hodel. And it was George Hodel for 2 pages. And then it was back to the revolving door of white men whose names I could barely keep track of. Luckily she has sort of the list of characters. So I could be Harry the Hat. Who was he again? But yeah, it's a book where it's basically all white men. And Elizabeth Short sort of barely gets mentioned after the first couple chapters.
Well, and obviously, Elizabeth Short's born in 24 in Boston and moves around a lot. And look, I know, listener, you might not know this, but in 1924, it was hard to keep track of people. It's easier now, but there are still people who are missing that are being searched for by the FBI and the CIA that they can't find today in 2022. So you can still disappear and go off the grid and live a less social media forward-facing existence. There are plenty of people that do. More of us don't than not, for plenty of reasons. But in between 24 and 47, it's very easy to just exist with nobody knowing about you.
Right.
And it's unfortunate because, obviously Elizabeth Short is one of those people. Her life would have been more than likely shockingly normal should she have existed and lived past 47. What she would have done, who knows? But odds on percentage are she would have lived a life like many other women would have at that time and passed away at an old age. And there you go. Nothing exciting. This happens, that changes it completely. And she loses her life in more ways than one. Nobody talks about Elizabeth Short anymore for a number of reasons. Like you've already mentioned, it's almost impossible to, because of the time and the place that this took place in, but it's not so long ago that we can't do the due diligence needed to find out information about her. And like you mentioned, I'm with you. I listened to the book And I had a hard time following along in the later second and third acts of the book because, yeah, it is just incompetence begetting incompetence, begetting incompetence, begetting incompetence. And by the end of the book, it's just like, okay, so the fucking cops are incompetent. Thanks. I knew that already. I exist in the world like the rest of us do, where we know law enforcement and the judicial system works sometimes, not even most of the time, not even half of the time. It works, maybe it works 2 out of 10 times type thing. And that's now. Imagine in 25, imagine in 47, when there's no body cams, when there's less meticulous note taking and everything else. And it's just, for me, yeah, you presented an interesting suspect. You presented a biography of Elizabeth Short, which I did appreciate, but you cannot discredit and disregard the big part of this case that is George Hodel. And that it's not even George Hodel was made a part of this case. He was part of this case then at the time. So why ignore it? Why pretend it doesn't exist unless you are part of the cover up, which she's not. So it's just weird to me that she's talking about there being a cover up, but refusing to acknowledge the actual suspect who has plenty of evidence pointing at him.
And whose son wrote a book arguing that it was his dad and providing evidence. And also, his son was a homicide detective for the LAPD. It wasn't just like some crazy person. So that just kind of irked me because it just felt like considering how exhaustively researched this book is, to have 2 pages on George Hodel seemed very peculiar.
Unless you just want to make sure everybody understands that your suspect is the one who killed Elizabeth Short, which again, I don't know if I can conclusively say that it wasn't Leslie Dillon, but I don't think it was. It just seems just like a guy, just a dude. Yeah. A weird guy, but being weird doesn't mean you go and cut a woman in half and drain her of all of her blood.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it was, again, like you said, like if she had just been found dead in a field, okay. But it's hard to imagine Leslie Dillon doing all that extra labor.
Right. Just for what? Because with George Hodel, you can get an idea of why he did what he did.
Yes.
Just talking about who he is. But with Leslie Dillon, it's like he was just a guy. He went and lived his life. Yeah, he named his daughter Elizabeth. Fine. Fairly common fucking name, by the way, everybody. Right. Like, I'm named Elizabeth. Yeah, well, plenty of women are named Elizabeth then, now, and forever. It's an extremely popular name. It
could have been his mother's name. Right. I mean, we have no way of knowing. But yeah, it just seemed weird because I feel like she presents, I think what irked me about it is that she presents the book as being this sort of, again, thoroughly researched, sort of objective depiction of, here is what happened, here are all the facts. But then it comes off as being very oddly slanted. So I don't know. It just seemed very strange to me that because there was definitely there was way too much information about other stuff, and then basically nothing about George Hodel.
Yeah. And I mean, again, the book sets itself out to be, it's about a cover up. And there was a cover up in the LAPD and they were covering it up. I also don't really get the sense as to why they were covering it up.
Unless it's George Hodel, in which case it does make sense. Right. Because he already had a case that was dropped despite the fact that there was overwhelming evidence that he had molested his daughter. And he still got acquitted because of his power. So if it is George Hodel, it does kind of he knew a lot of people. He was very influential. He had a lot of money. He already he got away with killing his secretary. He got away with molesting his daughter. So it kind of wouldn't surprise me if he was able to pull some strings to get away with this. Whereas I can't imagine Leslie Dillon being able to pull any strings.
Well, Leslie Dillon lived a rather boring life after 1947. In her book, she talks about all these other suspects who just disappear. They just go off and live normal lives. And so did Leslie Dillon. But George Hodel did not. I mean, he went to the Philippines and was just, he just disappeared. But he disappeared intentionally. It's not like he moved out of LA and went to live in Sedona, I mean, Leslie Dillon did go and change his name and lived under a different name somewhere else. But George Hodel, the sphere of influence that he existed within makes more sense that he had more to do with this. It just, there's in my mind, I can't conclusively even say it was him, even with all of the evidence that Steve Hodel presents in his book, but it's a more compelling case just on the face of it, with just the minor amounts of evidence of what George Hodel was doing at the time.
Right.
That's the big thing. Like you mentioned, George Hodel offering effectively what people would call now back alley abortions. Mm-hmm. How many women died that never got found? That were, not every woman that was, and I'm not gonna say murdered, but effectively accidentally murdered by George Hodel because of, when you make abortions fucking illegal and then women have to go get them, they fucking die. Yeah, in the back alley. Good God, that's a conversation that factors into this heavily, obviously. How many other women died that weren't, presented in this way? Why he presented her this way is a different story, but I can't help but wonder if there's more cases that he was involved in to begin with. Again, it would all be circumstantial at this point. There's no way to prove any of this anymore. Even George Hodel said as much after his secretary was dead. He was like, you can't prove if I did it anyways. My secretary's dead. You killed her. So yeah, of course. I don't know. That's the thing. Like George Hodel, just on the face of him, is a more compelling suspect than anything that is mentioned in Black Dahlia, Red Rose. And that's unfortunate because I do love a good conspiracy. I do. Who doesn't? Who doesn't want to think that the cops are up to no good? I would prefer to think that the cops are up to no good rather than they're just complete bumbling idiots like half of everybody who has a job in the world. Right. Just look around the job that any of us have and think about the people that we work with that we don't think do a very good job. And then think about that in a police station where their jobs have higher stakes than most of ours do. And those people not doing a good job, it's not a conspiracy. That's just people not doing their job very well. I mean, it could be interpreted as a conspiracy, I guess. But to say, in 1947, the LAPD weren't up to the task of investigating the murder of a woman in an empty lot somewhere that the killer took painstaking steps to make sure they couldn't solve, that's not a conspiracy. That's just inept policing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I feel like, I don't know, I'm just more convinced by the George Hodel theory. And again, other than the secretary and his daughter and the Black Dahlia, I don't know of any other specific cases, but I know that his son, because yes, you're right, George Hodel moved to the Philippines, and his son argues that his dad would periodically come back to the United States, commit a murder and then go back to the Philippines. And I don't know. So I think, first of all, I feel like anybody who commits a murder like the Black Dahlia, it's not going to be a one-time thing. They've probably already killed before and they're going to kill again because it's just so kind of over the top. But then also the surgical skill to do that kind of mutilation, Leslie Dillon was like an assistant, as like a mortician's assistant. I mean, that it's a completely different thing from the skill of being a surgeon. Despite the fact that Eatwell claims that none of Elizabeth Short's friends knew George Hodel, there are documented witnesses that say that they knew that the two of them had some kind of a relationship. I don't know if relationship is too strong of a word, but there are, I think, like 8 witnesses or something that supposedly said that, there was a connection between the two of them. The influence of the surrealism, and if you go and you look, you can see that there are, there are Man Ray artworks in which the woman is presented as, being a series of body parts. And then after the Black Dahlia murder, there's a Duchamp photograph of a woman lying in the grass that is made to look like the Black Dahlia. I mean, there's this sort of weird kind of art world connection, and the way that the body was presented. Again, I feel like if Leslie Dillon had killed her, he would have like buried her in a field, right? I mean, it serves him no benefit to have the body found, that's murder 101. Whereas George Hodel clearly thought that he was like immune, right? I mean, they have, even Eatwell talks about how, that Hodel knew that his house was bugged and would make comments like, so what if I killed the Black Dahlia? They won't be able to prove it. And for some reason, she argues that therefore means that he didn't do it. And I'm like, I don't know. It seems like the kind of thing that he would be joking around about if he felt like he was untouchable. I mean, it just, it reminds me of, what's his name? The guy who killed his wife in the documentary, who at the very end of the documentary was like in the bathroom and he was like, so what if I killed her?
Robert Durst.
Yes, Robert Durst. Exactly. So to me, it feels like it's that kind of thing where it's like you feel like you're untouchable and you're making a joke about it because you feel complacent. But also, again, going back to the way the body was presented, the body is laid out, right? I mean, just the hands over the head, the way the pieces of the body were arranged, she's laid out like an art piece, right? I mean, it's almost like this like diorama in this field, which fits in with George Hodel and his interest in sadomasochism and his crazy sex parties. Again, not saying that people who have crazy sex parties are murderers, but he was, he had this kind of depraved, these depraved interests, which is documented. I'm not like inventing this. And so I can imagine him being like, hey, Man Ray, let me show you this cool thing that I can do with the body. So I don't know. I just felt like Eatwell kind of missed the boat by not getting into Hodel enough.
Well, and more to even George Hodel, in my mind, at least, kind of the story that I've concocted in my head is, Elizabeth Short went to him for an abortion and she died unintentionally, intentionally, however you want to look at it. The intent doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned, because what ends up happening after the fact is more what is George Hodel's mission after the fact, is to just fully embrace fully embrace a darker side of himself by, bisecting her body, by, taking pleasure in mutilating her corpse, which again, it leans on the things that we know about him, the things that he is into, sexual sadism. Mm-hmm. And sexual sadists mutilate corpses. We've seen it with Dahmer, with BTK, with plenty of current contemporary serial killers and mass murderers who are sexual sadists. They mutilate the corpses. Did George Hodel ever do it again? Like you've mentioned, who knows? We can't know. Steve Hodel can prognosticate whatever the hell he wants, just like anybody can prognosticate about any Zodiac murder that may or may not have happened, or, even fucking Henry Lee Lucas. I mean, that was the entire thing with him, was just prognosticating about all these kills that he did that it turns out he didn't do. I don't think there's any point in prognosticating what George Hodel may or may not have done after Elizabeth Short, but I think what may have happened is George Hodel was gifted an opportunity to do something he's always wanted to do, even if he didn't mean to kill Elizabeth Short, even if he didn't intend that, even if that's not why she showed up and he looked at her and went, all right, well, I'm going to kill you. I don't think that's what happened. I think he was presented with an opportunity to do something that he'd always wanted to do, which is mutilate a corpse, which again, if you're him and she dies in your house, you have to do something with the body one way or another. Like you mentioned, if it's Leslie Dillon, he's just going to go and dispose of it. She'll just disappear because there's no point. There is no point in presenting something this grotesque and gruesome unless you are wanting people to see it. And that's, again, George Hodel, the things that he is excited by and interested in track with what we end up seeing as Elizabeth Short's kind of tableau that he's constructed. Yes. No, tableau is the right word that it is. It becomes a sort of tableau, which doesn't sync up at all with Leslie Dillon. Syncs up with someone who's a narcissist and a sociopath and enjoys being sexually sadistic. And also a lover of surrealist art, because you can see in the mutilation and the arrangement of the body are clear references to surrealist art and specifically to works by Man Ray, who was a friend of his. So I feel like it makes sense when viewed through that lens. I agree. And, that is kind of where the story pivots in my mind, because now that Elizabeth Short has been murdered, you have all of the things that come out of that, all of the way that society becomes wrapped up in it. Because again, talking about the Black Dahlia and making sure to keep mentioning Elizabeth Short's name over and over again, the moment her body is found and they find out what her name is, they don't, there's nothing else past that. It's, well, this is who she is. We have some cursory information about her, but Black Dahlia, the person who reaches out to the cops and the journalist calls himself not the murderer of Elizabeth Short, calls himself the Black Dahlia Avenger, which would track with who George Hodel was. I think that for me, the Black Dahlia Avenger kind of weird offshoot of all of this, I think that for me is the piece of information that cements it as George Hodel, because given what we know about Zodiac and other serial killers or murderers who are, interacting with the police in a kind of secretive way, not, being honest and upfront about it, someone like BTK, the Zodiac, Jack the Ripper, they enjoyed the games after the fact. They enjoyed being the smartest person in the room. And everything that you read and learn about George Hodel would lead you to believe he's that kind of person. Why did he not do as much as he claimed he was going to do, the Black Dahlia Avenger? Because the Black Dahlia Avenger essentially claims that he's going to send all this stuff, sends some things, and then doesn't, essentially just disappears and stops interacting. I think he stops interacting with the police as the Black Dahlia Avenger because maybe someone said to him, hey, George, you can get away with it, but you can't taunt the cops. You can't rub it in their face. I think
or he just got bored and moved on to the next shiny object.
Right. It's one of those two things. I mean, again, I think you may be right in that it's just whatever. I've moved on, but I also think that there may be something to, you can't just, you can go up to the cliff, but you can't jump off of it. And for a lot of us, jumping off the cliff is going and murdering someone. I think his cliff is a lot longer, and it's more of a don't start, because BTK was dropping hints of who he was, and Zodiac sending ciphers, and George Hodel or the Black Dahlia Avenger, whoever that person was, didn't go that far. They stopped before it got to that point where they're really kind of rubbing it, rubbing their, I forget what the fucking Zodiac says, I'm going to rub your boo-boos in it or something to that effect. He doesn't do that. And I wish that in the book they had gone into more about the Black Dahlia Avenger and what that meant to the case, because it's a weird part of this case that I'm not even sure a lot of people know, that whoever murdered Elizabeth Short did interact with the press and with the cops. They know that person who killed her is the person that they were talking to.
Yeah, that's why I just found it weird, because I felt like there were certain things, it was like ad nauseum with the details. Like it was just, I was like, oh my God, like enough already. Like just so much information about certain things. And then other things, it was like she just left it out.
Right.
Like it made no sense. I don't know. It's just very strange.
In my mind, it's being left out because that is information that could be easier to link with George Hodel than Leslie Dillon. Because in the book, there's never really any reasoning as to why Leslie Dillon would have been doing that. No, why would he have been interacting with the cops? Why would he have been sending that? Why would he have been flaunting how much smarter he is than the authorities? What would have led him as a person to put himself in the position to do that? And that's the question we don't know with Zodiac. Why is Zodiac doing what he's doing? Well, you can say it's because he's a serial killer, he's unhinged, he's a sociopath. But then if you look at this case, you have someone that you could look at and ask those questions and get answers, because George Hodel's life has been chronicled more or less in its entirety by his son, at least what his son knows about his dad and can find out about it. And it would track that he would interact with the cops that way. Absolutely. Because he thinks he's untouchable already. So,
whereas Dillon just wants to be left alone.
Right.
Which again, why would you display a corpse in that way if you don't want any attention? But also, I don't know, he just doesn't seem like he'd be smart enough to play those kind of, three-dimensional chess with the cops.
Right. And that was not, at least my interpretation, that was not something that would have ever motivated him anyways.
No, as evidenced by the fact that he leaves town and changes his name and clearly, just wants to disappear into the crowd kind of thing.
Right. The person who killed Elizabeth Short did not disappear into the crowd. They went away, but they didn't disappear. George Hodel never changed his name. No. George Hodel was still George Hodel to the day he died.
Mm-hmm.
Proud of it too, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah. But I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of cultural impact about the Black Dahlia, the Black Dahlia murder, because again, to move, to kind of set Elizabeth Short aside, but talk about the impact of what it has now on society. And I guess the way that the case is still talked about now it's still not about Elizabeth Short. It never will be, obviously. But it's interesting to me how much interest still exists in this case, because for all intents and purposes, it is just another woman who was murdered in the 40s in Los Angeles. Like you said, 15 years later, we have an actress who is much more kind of internationally known than Elizabeth Short. And she is, we could have that conversation till we're blue in the face. Is she murdered or not? But Elizabeth Short was murdered conclusively. It's not a question of that. And it's interesting that the dialogue about the case almost immediately becomes, how can we connect this to pop culture of the time? And then how does pop culture start looking at it and saying, well, we can dramatize this and turn this into something that makes it more palatable. I mean, you turn something into a movie or a TV show or a comic strip or whatever, you take the nastiness out immediately. I mean, the Dahmer show does a great job of it. Jeffrey Dahmer was fucking people's corpses and eating their body parts. That Netflix show shows none of that. And you know why? Because if it did, you would not want to watch it. You would not want to watch Evan Peters eating another man's penis, no matter how into Evan Peters you may be, or how attractive you find him, or how good of an actor he is. Nobody wants to see that. And that for me is at the core of the true crime issue, which is, like you've already mentioned, she was cut in half, her blood was drained, and she was sexually mutilated. There's nothing sexy or fun about that. But to get to the point where the Black Dahlia case is now in pop culture, they had to take all of the reality out of it. They had to drain it of the repercussions that it had on someone's life and the community at large in Los Angeles.
I think I haven't seen I'm sort of boycotting Netflix at the moment, so I haven't seen the Dahmer show.
You don't need to.
I know, and I'm intentionally not watching it. But I didn't know that they sort of left out those gruesome details, because it's such a part of what made him so awful. So they don't show any of that stuff?
No. It's all just again, they do the thing that I think can be successful when we're talking about non-true crime cases, which is they leave it up to the audience's imagination. But all you have to do as an audience member is go and read. Cursory amounts of information are available on the internet to inform you about how terrible these murders are. And the show, instead of really presenting it warts and all, just it art houses it up. Just like with what Dita Von Teese did, they take all of the gore and the blood out and they leave a bloodless corpse that you're left as an audience member to look at and go, well, that's pretty, or that's an interesting usage of Casey and the Sunshine Band's Please Don't Go, which is what the Dahmer show does, which if you know anything about the Dahmer case, that song makes perfect sense, but it's a fucking song. Like, now you've ruined the song and you're trying to, again, give us an idea of the mindset of Jeffrey Dahmer, but not really giving us the mindset, which is a deeply troubled individual. And that's the problem with this story, is it is about an innocent woman who, regardless of what she was doing, getting an abortion, a sex worker, what have you, she was innocent. And that they never mention that. They never talk about that. They make Elizabeth Short complicit in her own murder in a lot of these stories. And that, again, it's a weird flipping of the narrative that I don't think has any place in a society that should be more in tune with one another's emotions and feelings. Because, again, I appreciate why true crime is popular and important to, I guess, society writ large, but to take it and fictionalize it and lose the person at the center of it, the victim or the murderer, is really doing everybody a disservice, the people watching it and the people who are involved.
I agree. And I think what else is interesting, and that could potentially fuel the George Hodel theory, but also that makes the Black Dahlia sensation kind of even more perplexing is that there are two other women who are killed in 1947. And they are killed, sort of horrifically, and their bodies are kind of left on display. Again, not as intensely as Elizabeth Short, which I think is one of the reasons why, I think it's the horrific way that she was mutilated and then displayed, which has given her sort of the longevity. But there's this woman, Evelyn Winters, who's killed in March, who's found with electrical wire and a dressing gown sort of tied around her neck. And then Jean French is the one with the lipstick murder, which Eatwell mentions briefly, but I feel like doesn't really unpack enough. And this is the one who has it says it's debated whether it says "fuck you BD" or "fuck you PD," like the police department, but written on her torso, and then she was kind of badly beaten. And Steve Hodel says that he thinks his dad was responsible for both of those. Obviously, we have no proof, but they're both unsolved. But no one knows about those two. And I don't know, is it because they didn't have a catchy nickname like the Black Dahlia because they were both, young, pretty white women? Or is it, the fact that they weren't cut in two with their body parts kind of spread out in an empty field? But there is something really fascinating with the fact, even, obviously she's not on Marilyn Monroe levels of fame, but there is a lot of name recognition for the Black Dahlia, whereas I don't know who knows, Jean French and the lipstick murder.
Well, and to your point, it is oddly ironic that two other women are killed and nobody remembers their cases at all, right. Let alone, again, we're sitting here really hammering home that people have forgotten Elizabeth Short's name. They know Black Dahlia, but they don't even know her name. To be murdered and people not even remember it at all. That's worse, obviously. But right. I think if I were to prognosticate as to why the Black Dahlia murder is so sensationalized, it has to be because she's cut in half and mutilated. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. It's only because her body is presented in such a way that it is shocking, beyond shocking. Beyond shocking. I mean, to be bisected and then sexually mutilated beyond that is most of the time, 99% of the time, when people murder one another, it is shockingly boring.
No, yeah.
Just shot in the head, stabbed in the neck, stabbed in the throat, stabbed a couple times. It's more murders that happen like that than are people being mutilated in quote unique and exciting ways, unquote. I'm not saying that, but other people would. And that's why the Black Dahlia murder gets brought up all the time. That's why Zodiac gets brought up because of his interaction with the police, but he was killing people in weird ritualistic ways. BTK, the Green River Killer, they all have a aspect of their killing that is taking bodies and doing things to them that is beyond the pale.
Which is why I'm interested in the fact that the Dahmer show leaves out the kind of like the worst of the worst, because isn't that what makes Dahmer as sort of sensational as he is? I mean, does the show imply that he's doing this stuff, or does it just imply that he's killing them?
It's heavily implied what he's doing, but you can't. Again, it strikes this idea of it's hard to make a serial killer sympathetic when he's chewing on somebody's, eyeballs.
Wait, the show makes him sympathetic?
Yeah. Wow. It mythologizes Jeffrey Dahmer. It tells his story as a child. It's the problem at the core of the true crime conversation that I've seen people on TikTok talking about, well, we're fucking gorehounds and we love it and we're here for it. And I get it. I mean, I get it. Like, there are people that love true crime, and I understand. You are probably listening to this show. You may be listening to this episode because it's a true crime thing. There's
a difference between loving true crime and mythologizing or making the killer seem empathetic.
Right.
You can be interested in it just in terms of like the facts and the story and, just the narrative element. But to make Jeffrey Dahmer to be almost like a sympathetic character, that's next level toxic. I mean, to me, that's on par with Dita Von Teese sexualizing a mutilated body.
Yeah, but at least that's just one picture and not 10 hours. On top of it, not only was it 10 hours of a TV show, but now there are 2 more seasons greenlit about other people.
Wow.
Again, people want to know about it. And I guess that there's no better way to do it than a fictionalized telling, because there definitely aren't documentaries that come out every year about all of these things. Netflix alone releases how many true crime documentaries a year? Well, there's 52 weeks in a year, so 52 at least. Every week there's some true crime.
That's their cash cow. Right. But like I enjoyed Mindhunter because I enjoyed that kind of the puzzling of building a case and finding the killer and all that. But it's told from the perspective of the profilers, and it's definitely not portraying the killer as being empathetic in any way.
That show is the only show that has done serial killers in a semi-fictionalized way, right? They show them for the fucking weirdos, freaks, monsters, grotesqueries that they were. And that's all they should be. They should never be the main character in their own story, because they already have been. That's how they got to this point. They thought they were the only character that mattered, and that's why they went and murdered people, cut them up, and were unable to control themselves because they thought they were the only ones that mattered. Why give them another opportunity? Why give them that again? I don't get it. I say I don't get it, but I get it. I think that's the line that I won't cross. Again, like you mentioned, I don't want to say there's a right way and a wrong way to do true crime, but I think there's a respectful way and a distasteful way. And again, that's subjective. That's just my opinion. People are going to disagree with me because they just want to see more. And that's the thing. We always want more, especially in this culture. It's always about not what we're watching now, but the next thing. What's the next thing? What are we going to watch next? What's the next thing that we can consume? And in a lot of ways, the Black Dahlia case is an interesting case study in that, because, we have in the 80s, James Ellroy writes a book about it. He writes the Black Dahlia book, which is
but it's a fictionalized story about the Black Dahlia, which is...
How do you do that?
I mean, I think it's kind of like Joyce Carol Oates did with Blonde, which is the fictionalized telling of Marilyn Monroe. But then what ends up happening is people, because some things in the story are true, so then people kind of assume that everything is true.
Right.
So it's really the same thing. It's like the fictionalized version of a real person. Well,
and the same thing happens with Joyce Carol Oates' Zombie, which is a fictional retelling of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. And it's, the people at the center of these stories that should be mythologized, that should have their stories told, are the Tony Hugheses of the world, who was murdered by Jeffrey Dahmer, the Elizabeth Shorts, who was murdered by someone, not the person doing it. Sure, we can talk about the case after the fact and the bungling of the investigation and what that meant for society then and what that means for society now. That's the best part of the Jeffrey Dahmer show, is once he's caught, they go into how society failed the victims. But that's in the last 4 fucking episodes. Come on. Like, the first 6 episodes are all about Jeffrey Dahmer and taking pictures and being a creep, and his apartment smells bad and everybody keeps talking about it and nobody can do anything. And even when they do, nobody does anything. That's more interesting to me than the beating us over the head with the information that you can go find on the internet if you just type his name in. You don't have to search that hard. And that's the thing with this case that, like you've kind of already mentioned, really needs to be hammered home. If you go and search the Black Dahlia, you're not going to find Elizabeth Short's name being mentioned. Her Wikipedia entry isn't even her name. It's Black Dahlia. And then it's the murder of Elizabeth Short. It's like that. This is not okay. And one of the reasons her case doesn't get solved is because the name Black Dahlia ends up just being more important than Elizabeth Short. It ends up taking on a life of its own. And some people may not even realize now, like we've kind of already mentioned, that it was a real person. And that's when it's really a problem, when the reality is lost in the fiction, like with James Ellroy's book, which is it's just weird to me. Like, all right. Like, I get why you're doing it, but just, I don't know. It's just strange. It's just kind of strange.
And also, just because we're talking about James Ellroy, I know I've harped on this Dita Von Teese photograph where she is lying corpse-like on the floor, and her hands and arms are made to look severed, and she's got the same slash on her face. And so I found the press release from the gallery where they're writing about this particular photograph, and they describe the image as Dita Von Teese slipping, quote, into the skin of James Ellroy's Dahlia Noir, the Black Dahlia, as if James Ellroy had created her.
Right.
Whereas, no, she was a real person and he wrote a book about her. But the press release, and I mean, again, it takes 2 seconds on Google, but the press release says that it is James Ellroy's Black Dahlia, which again goes back to the fact that her life has now been dominated by all these men and that her own voice has just been completely lost. Like now, apparently, she's James Ellroy's.
Right. And no, I agree with you. It's very strange that, again, the fictionalization of who she was becomes more important than the reality, because the reality is shockingly boring. She was just another woman trying to make her way in a world.
Well, we don't know, changing. Actually.
Right.
We don't know because we don't know her story. Right. We just know what Eatwell found out.
Right. Which is, again, like my assumption is she's just a plain human being existing in the world. And because she's murdered, she's important. She should have been important otherwise.
She could have been having a torrid affair with George Hodel and hanging out at his sex parties and performing in orgies with Man Ray. But we don't know because we don't even know who gave her the nickname. We don't even know if she really was an aspiring actress. These are like the basic facts. So she could have been a fascinating person and we have no idea because it's like, I don't know, just crazy because there was like so much media coverage of this murder and nobody wrote like a piece about the woman. Like, here is a biography of the person it was like all everybody cared about was like, let's find the murderer. I don't know.
They didn't even do that.
And they didn't even do that. I mean, it's so peculiar to me.
Well, and I guess I still don't really have a good sense of why that is the way it is. It seems like the answer to that question is maybe the most important answer that we'll never get is why is this case the way that it is? And I don't think there's any one answer. I think we've kind of touched on all of the reasons you could look at, but there are like even something like the JonBenet Ramsey case, where it's another unsolved murder of a white child. I mean, again, woman, child, however you want to perceive it. Even that case isn't treated this way. JonBenet Ramsey's name is part of that. Like it's not referred to as, the toddlers and tiara case. It's not. It's right. Weird that this may be one of the few times that the victim gets a nickname.
Mm-hmm. No, that was my point. It's usually the killer that gets the nickname. I
think I don't want to say this is it exclusively, but for Western American culture, at least, it is, right?
It's definitely the most well-known.
Right.
And again, it's not that she was given a nickname because we didn't know her real name. Like, we know her real name. It got superseded by the nickname. So I would say my answer for why things turned out the way they did is the magical trifecta of corruption, incompetence, and misogyny.
Yeah. And it's still going on. I mean, her story now is not being presented. I mean, even when Ryan Murphy did his, like you mentioned, his like kind of like homage to it, it was not about her. It was about the Matt Ross character playing George Hodel, because he is the one who lived in that house in the show. She just is there and dies, and that's it. It's about Matt Ross's George Hodel stand-in character. It's like, you missed the point. Even when you were trying to make a point, you missed a point. And that's honestly what the book felt like. The book feels the same way. It's like you're trying to make a point, but you missed the point by about a country mile and then some.
Yep. Agreed.
And nobody has done Elizabeth Short a singular amount of justice in the last however many years since she died. And I don't know if they ever will. And in any conversation that anybody has, well, there's no way you don't mention the Black Dahlia. Nobody calls it the murder of Elizabeth Short. And that's what it should be called, because that's what that event is. The Black Dahlia stuff is all after the fact. It's again, even if her nickname existed before she was murdered, which nobody can even agree on, that's like we've said, singular fact. The Black Dahlia is something that is after the fact. And it's after the fact, and it gets in the way of a woman who was murdered in a horrifying way. Again, maybe she wasn't murdered in a horrifying way, but her body was desecrated in, I can't imagine being in the situation where you look down at a body and you're like, I'm going to just have my way. It's like that. It's just a mindset that thankfully very few people in the world actually can understand. And those people hopefully are no longer able to do anything about it. They're put away. But again, we don't know who killed Elizabeth Short. So that person may have walked around for a very long time, and they did walk around for a very long time. And that's the problem here. It's not anything else. It's that Elizabeth Short died and her killer was never caught. Anything else is just noise.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I can't remember. I was just looking in the book, but I can't remember because I feel like some of the mutilation and stuff happened before she was like pre-death, but I can't remember the exact details to argue convincingly one way or the other.
I mean, either way, it's awful, right?
Awful.
And that's, again, I think with the trivialization of the reality, that is all that matters, is making it less awful by taking out the parts that you don't like. But you can't talk about this without having a frank conversation about one person standing over another person and taking their life, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say neither one of us have any idea what that's like, thankfully.
No, not at all.
I don't know. The Black Dahlia case it's just such a bummer. Obviously, I mean, all unsolved true crime is. But when you look at the woman at the center of the case and her life being taken away from her, and again, like we mentioned, we don't know who she was, but I'd like to believe she had a full life ahead of her, regardless of what she was going to do. And that's the sad part here. Is I'm older than Elizabeth Short was when she died, and
she was 22, I think.
Yeah, I'm 10 years older than she is. Like, that's horrifying to think about, to have had your life end there, especially in 47, like right before the world is about to get really interesting and exciting. And yet all Elizabeth Short is remembered for is that somebody else cut her in half and displayed her body after they sexually mutilated her. And that is the ultimate takeaway for me, is that we as society can do better and should do better in the way we talk about, analyze, and kind of come to terms with true crime. Because if you want to watch true crime, I get it. But you really need to make peace with yourself about what you want out of it, what you need out of it, and what you're going to be okay not learning about, but making amends with how you deal with that information after the fact. And that's not a conversation people are really having, because it's all about the next great serial killer TV show, clearly.
Yeah, and I think just the stripping of her humanity, right? The fact that, biographical information's basically been totally omitted from coverage of the case, but also the sexualizing of it, and that, the media at the time were, basically said it, that she was this sort of harlot who was sleeping her way through Hollywood, and that the murder was sort of the sexual fiend had killed her and all this stuff, which again, maybe, but we know as much about that as we do about other biographical elements of her life, in which case nothing at all. So it was just this narrative was imposed upon her to, basically tell a better story for the newspapers. Right. And then that just become part of the urban legend, that she was, even with the Ryan Murphy American Horror Story, which I get is not a documentary, but it's, again, that she was this aspiring actress who was, sleeping her way to get roles and all this stuff. And that in interviews, Ryan Murphy's talking about it as if this was a known fact. And it's but actually it's not.
It's an assumption, a massive assumption, because, she was in LA in the 40s. And why were women in LA in the 40s, Ryan Murphy? I guess everybody in LA who was a beautiful woman wanted to be an actress, because beautiful people don't live in LA right now and they don't work in the entertainment industry, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, so I think that's what upsets me the most about her story, is that it's the actual biographical details don't matter.
Well, and you've mentioned it, several times already, and to echo your point, the inherent massive heaping of misogyny that is leveled and layered into this case, I think is, it's awful. Thankfully, we are getting past it. I feel like now, I feel like is the term I'm going to use, because I'm not going to come down on it either way, because I know I'm probably wrong. But we as a society, I feel like, have done better now at presenting. I feel like if Elizabeth Short existed today and was murdered today the way she was murdered then, I would like to believe that we would not 50 years ago be dealing with that case the way we're dealing with the Black Dahlia case now. Does that make sense?
It does. And I feel like maybe because of the internet, the ease with which we can get people's biographical I mean, you see it like, whenever there's like a school shooting and people are like, oh, well, here's what the guy was posting on Facebook,
Right.
So it's easier to get this information than it was back then. But still, as I said, like the fact that there's no media coverage that says she was an actress or an aspiring actress, or she was not an aspiring actress, or who gave her the nickname. I mean, it's just like, how is that not known?
Yeah. And like we've mentioned, I mean, it's just at the time, it's unconscionable that they didn't do their due diligence. Now it can be kind of, unless you're writing a book about it, like Black Dahlia, Red Rose, you can be forgiven for not knowing every single piece of information about Elizabeth Short. But at the time, they should have. At the time, right. They should have. And if they had, we might not be having this conversation the way we're having it now. We might not have the same complaints that we have now. Mm-hmm. Her murder not being solved is a massive issue. But I would go as far as to say that obviously you can't change that she's been murdered, but we can change the narrative around her now. And that's the more important thing now, more than ever, is not solving the case, because you can't solve it. Can't solve any of these. You can't solve a murder that happened a year ago in a lot of cases, let alone in 47. But we can change the dialogue surrounding how her case is talked about and reintroduce and reassess who she was. And that should be the way we have this conversation moving forward. Take all of the other stuff out of it, because all that other stuff is just people trying to turn this into something for their own financial needs, is what it really feels like, or personal gain.
Yeah, exactly. Or just be explicit about, hey, this is what's happening.
Right. And to think that they didn't do that then, and that has affected us now, is just, it just goes to show, things do change, but in a lot of ways they do stay the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a bummer of a case to talk about. Really, I mean, it is, it's just, but it's important because, again, like you've mentioned, I think it's a very strong contender for a case that we could use to inform how a lot of other cases we talk about now are talked about and are covered, and the way the media kind of reacts to the people at the center of it and the kind of the hullabaloo surrounding it.
Yeah, I was briefly mentioned to you before we started recording that I just watched this TV show that was on BritBox, which I'm obsessed with because I watch lots of British shows. That's called Karen Pirie. Pirie, which is interestingly, it's a young detective is looking into a crime from, I think, 26 years prior where this woman was killed. And similarly, there's lots of police incompetence and corruption, so it was never solved. And it just reminded me a lot of the Black Dahlia case, except that in the show it's solved. But just, the misogyny, the incompetence, and the corruption.
And it's misogyny, but yet everybody is like, oh, it was a woman who was killed. We need to solve the case. But it's like, but yet everybody actually, at least the people involved, don't actually care. Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of hypocrisy at the center of it that I have a really hard time wrapping my head around. I really do. Because it's just, again, like I said, I already said unconscionable once. I'll say it again. All of this is unconscionable, the way that her case was treated by the cops and the journalists. And it's just, yeah, all right. I guess it'll never be solved. And they could have solved it. And they chose not to for whatever reason, be it influence from someone else, be it incompetence, be it misogyny, or all of it mixed together into this disgusting slurry that we get now. Mm-hmm. So you want to give a final thought on the Black Dahlia case, the murder of Elizabeth Short, as it were?
I will just say that I continue to be fascinated by it, and I really want to write a proper essay about it. So far, it eludes me a little bit, but kind of like we were saying, I'd like to at least paint sort of a picture that draws attention to what we've been talking about, and the way that she's been stripped of her humanity, and what that sort of says about the way that we, sexualize and glamorize female death, especially when it's a young, pretty woman.
Yeah, because they're not doing that for men.
No.
No,
and it has to do with how women are, objectified and displayed as these pieces of art, and the kind of the idea of female as spectacle. And yeah, I mean, can you imagine Dita Von Teese making a lingerie line named for one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims? I mean, there's something really weird about the Black Dahlia as this kind of entity where it's a murdered, disfigured, mutilated woman who has somehow, history has painted her as glamorous and sexy.
Her death was glamorous.
Yeah. I just keep trying to wrap my head around that.
There is no glamour in death, regardless of how your body is presented after the fact. You're still dead.
Yeah. I don't know. And the Dita Von Teese was like, oh, here's a great idea. Let me recreate a mutilated corpse and make it pretty.
If her intent was subversion, she hit those notes. But in terms of taste, about as poor a taste as humanly possible. And again, you're not helping the conversation either as a woman doing that. You're not helping anybody, but you're really not helping your own conversation that you should be having, because you should be able to have a much interesting conversation as a woman who can offer insight about the perception in the media about yourself and how you're perceived. And instead it's like, I'm just going to pose half naked. Okay.
Oh, but it's like, if you're going to recreate the Black Dahlia corpse to be subversive, then recreate the Black Dahlia corpse. Don't recreate it up to that line where it's still pretty and photogenic.
Right.
That I think is what disturbs me. Plus, obviously the photo shoots in the house. And then I can't remember if I mentioned that in one of the photo shoots, it's like the name of the photo is Dita Von Teese and the Black Dahlia house. And it's not the Black Dahlia house. It was George Hodell's house, where we think Elizabeth Short was murdered. But I don't know, it's just this weird erasure and mythology. And it's very fascinating. And I keep trying to unpack it and understand it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's a case that, again, I only really knew about cursory before, we had our conversation a month and a half ago and kind of put this on the books. And so spending some time with the case in the last month and a half and reading the book and then doing other research and just watching things, it's a multifaceted case, but at the center of it all is just a human being who did not ask for this to happened right to them. And then everybody forgot that person existed because, well, there's this really interesting way that the body was laid out. And it's like, that's, God damn it, people. You're just, we forgot that there are human beings that exist too. I guess everything that we don't have a direct connection to is entertainment. That's it. It's singularly for my entertainment. It's like, Elizabeth Short had a mom and dad too. And, they don't talk, they talk about the mom a little bit in the book, but I think they say something to the effect of her dad left. But
right.
He saw that her father had to have known she died, because that case was so prolific at the time. And it's just like, you forget the human aspect of this. And that's not a society I want to live in, frankly, where we forget that there's a human being at the center of this. And it's, as recently as, we've kind of mentioned, another Ryan Murphy joint with the Dahmer show. You have forgotten the humanity at the center of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. We need to be a better society for everybody, the people that are here and the people that aren't. And it's just a shame. So on that overtly depressing note, Dahlia, where could people find you on the internet? Should they want to find your future and past and current works?
They can go to my website, which is just thisisdahlia.com, DAHLIA. They can find me on Twitter, although I don't post often enough, at Dr. Dahlia. And then they can also, all this stuff is linked from my website, but they can also find me on Instagram if they are so inclined, which is just instagram.com/Dahlia Schweitzer.
I would say at some point we're not going to have to plug Twitter anymore. It'll be gone.
Yeah, it'll be Mastodon.
it'll be gone, and we won't have to worry about it, and something else will take its place. So
yeah, clock is ticking.
Yeah. As for me, scarystorieswetell.com. I was going to say Patreon, but there's not a Patreon. Scarystorieswetell.com, Scary Stories WT on all social media, but just listen to the show, like, rate, and review. That's all you got to do. Big thanks as always to Maggie the Odd and Dustin Rutledge for the album artwork for the show, and to our good friend Alex Malnack of Blondo. You can find his band on Spotify. Just search Blondo. Dahlia, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun, even if the subject material is overtly depressing.
Thank you.
And we'll let our good friend, the former host of Sightings, Mr. Tim White, lead us out.
No mystery is closed to an open mind.